We're going to talk about three different types of tasks in this nugget: importing data, exporting data, and converting data, and the differences between those. We're also going to talk about three different formats for importing, exporting, and converting: CSV, CLI XML, and HTML. And while all of that's going to be useful to you, the real goal here is to get you to thinking about what's in that PowerShell pipeline. What is in the pipeline at each stage? We're going to start building multi-command pipes, multi-command one-liners, where information is created and passed from command to command to command. And the way to avoid problems and to really make yourself a PowerShell expert is to always be thinking about what's in the pipeline at each stage. These guys are just going to be convenient ways for us to explore that concept. We'll start, as usual, in Windows 7 here using PowerShell version 2. And the techniques and stuff we're going to talk about in this nugget, pretty much you're going to be able to see all of it right here in this version, because these are real fundamentals about how PowerShell works. Now, the first thing I'd like to show you is a little stupid PowerShell trick. Just imagine what that would do for a second. Think about it. It's pretty obvious. And if you said it's going to stop every process on the computer, you're close to right. It probably won't. It will probably stop the PowerShell process before it gets to everything else, and hopefully just kill PowerShell and not blue screen my entire computer. But it could, you never know, and that's certainly the intent, is to stop every computer, or stop every process on the computer. But what's important here is to think about what it's doing. Now, you've got a pipeline. Now, if you think of that as an actual pipe, then it's divided into two segments, and this pipe character divides those segments. So when I run the first command, it's producing data of some kind, and it's putting that data into the pipeline. The pipeline carries that data to the next command, which does whatever it's going to do and produces whatever output it's going to produce, and its output goes into the pipeline. Now at this stage, we're at the end of the pipeline. So there's actually a little secret part of the pipeline here called out default. This is going to take whatever output happens to be in the pipeline at that point, and in this console application, its job is to actually take it from out default. It's hard-coded to go to another command called out host, and that's what actually constructs the display that you see on the screen when you run a command that produces output. So we can kind of see this in action. I'm going to add a switch called what if. This switch should be supported by any command that modifies the system state, and I would definitely regard stopping a process as modifying the system state. And you can tell if a command supports this. It'll be listed in the command's help, but this is just going to keep the command from running, and instead of running, it's going to tell me what it would do. So there you go. It's telling me I would have performed the operation stop process on all of these different processes. And I'm guessing it would have gotten here to PowerShell, killed the shell, and the rest of these probably would not actually have happened. So when you run a normal command, just get process, that same thing happens. We're running get process, we're putting its results into the pipeline, and because there is no other command after this, the output that's in the pipeline goes to out default, goes to out host, and we get a display on the screen. The trick here is that you only get an on-screen display if there was something in the pipeline to go to out default and then out host. If you have a command that doesn't produce any output to the pipeline, well, then there's nothing to display on the screen. And here's a perfect example of that. Let's just say get process, export CSV, and we'll give it a file name here. Oops, I think we give it a path. Nothing on the screen. Now, what that means is this get process command ran. Okay, so let's draw our pipeline again. Got our pipeline. We've got our pipe character. Get process ran. It put data into the pipeline. That data was sent to export CSV. It produced a CSV file on disk, I assume. We'll check that in a second. But it did not put anything in the pipeline. So there's nothing in the pipeline at this point. That means our little secret out default had nothing to pick up and send on to out host, and so nothing displayed on the screen. Now, if you want to regard that file on disk as output, you can. It's certainly an action that the commandlet completed, but it didn't go into the pipeline. So it's really important to understand as we start building more and more complicated pipelines like this, that the pipeline can contain something different at each stage. And if at any stage the pipeline contains nothing, then there's nothing to go on to the next command. So let's actually check our math here and make sure that we've got a little directory listing. There's our procs.csv. Let's just look at that in Notepad. Hopefully that's roughly what you expected. We've got a CSV file. There's a header row telling me I have columns like name, handles, and so forth. That's the header row. And then I've got a data row for each one. Conhost is the name, RSS is the name, and so forth. I could look at that same raw text using getContent, which uses the aliases type or cat, if you prefer those. Again, getContent is really similar to using Notepad in that it's not attempting to parse or understand this file. It's just spewing the contents of the file to the screen. Now, if I used a command called export, there's an implication that there's an opposing command. And it's good to investigate these things. Whenever you learn a new command, like export CSV, see what else there is that can deal with that same noun, because here's an import CSV. Now, unlike getContent, this is actually reading the file and parsing it, or attempting to understand the file. So instead of just spewing the raw text to the screen, it's actually reconstructed the data. It's taken all the column headers and produced this information, and then it's taken all the values and listed out each process in this long list. I mean, that's certainly useful. There's ways to make this prettier, and we're going to work on those ways. I want to contrast this with a couple other commands that I just showed you, which are convert to and convert from. Let's look and see what that does. Get process, convert to CSV. So it's converting it to CSV, but it's leaving it in the pipeline. So let's draw that out as well now. So here in the pipeline, we had get process, which put some data into the pipeline, and that was separated. And then we had convert to CSV. That took the data out of the pipeline, converted it into a CSV form, but put that into the pipeline. Now that means our little secret out default had something to display. So the difference between convert to and export as a verb, convert to and export both change the form of something. So if I use CSV on both of these, it's changing whatever was in the pipeline into CSV. Convert to puts it in the pipeline. Export puts it out on disk. That's the difference between them. Now, we can kind of make them do the same thing. That's functionally the same as what we did earlier, wherever it went, there. Functionally the same, both of those. Get process in both instances is putting stuff into the pipeline. Here, export CSV is picking it up, transforming it, and writing it to disk. Here, convert to CSV is picking it up and transforming it, but putting it back in the pipeline, where it can be picked up by a command that writes it out to disk. So it's really important to remember the difference between these convert to and export commands. The verbs themselves imply a difference in the way these things operate. Now you also need to be a little bit careful about the format itself, the CSV format I mean. Let's stop thinking about processes for a second and think about services. Right? If you have a service, you know it has things like a name and a display name, and it's got a status, right? Running, stopped, whatever else. But it also has dependent services. And each of those is a complete service with a name and a display name, and might have more dependent services and so on. So you can see how this starts to build up a hierarchy. I've got a piece of information which contains other pieces of information, which might contain other pieces of information, not unlike a directory tree, right? Folder, file, 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 folder, file, file, folder. So it's a hierarchy of data. CSV files are inherently incapable of doing a good job with a hierarchy of data. CSV files are intrinsically a flat file format. They can't represent a hierarchy. They can't represent, So here's what happens when we run get service, export CSV services. I'm going to open that in Notepad. See, the second property here, the first one is name, and that's looking good. AE lookup, ALG, app management, bits, and so forth. The second property here, second piece of information in this header is required services. And every single column has that in it, every single row. System.serviceProcess.ServiceController with the 2 square brackets. Now, if you remember from our nugget on help, when you see the 2 square brackets jammed against each other, it means you've got multiples. So what this is saying is AE lookup service has multiple required services. But because this is a CSV file, that's all I can tell you. I can't break it down and display an entire list of services within this one column. So anytime, and I get so frustrated with this because folks will wind up on the forums at PowerShell.org, for example, and they have this hierarchical type of output. For example, I've got a user, and he's in a bunch of groups, and I want to create a CSV file that's got the user's name and then a list of all his groups. And it's actually a little bit difficult to do that in PowerShell, at least in a CSV, because the CSV doesn't want to contain that kind of hierarchy. But we have another format that can. CLI, Command Line Interface XML. This is kind of a private XML format that Windows PowerShell creates for itself and understands. I'll change my file name extension to be something meaningful. Now let's open that up. You can see here that this is going to inherently do a little bit better of a job of breaking things down. For example, what are we starting with here? We're starting with the name, looking for the name of this thing, application experience. That's the display name of this first one. Then it can break down its dependent services, and it can, now this one doesn't happen to have any, but you can see how the indentation lets it do that as we get down and further in. So there is a corresponding import, and it's able to actually reconstruct the same type of display that we would get if we ran get service. So this is reading that file, interpreting the XML, putting the converted stuff into the pipeline, and when our secret out default gets hold of it, it looks like a regular service. And so out default knows how to display a service. It does it in this 3-column table. It's the same thing you would see if you just ran get service. Difference being, of course, the XML file's services are a snapshot from when I created the XML file. It's not live data. Here's a great use of that. Let's run get process again and export that to a CLI XML this time. Now let's say, for example, that I'm on a server computer. Now, I think most organizations would probably agree that once you get a server set up and running, the processes that it is running should be a pretty fixed list. You shouldn't have brand new stuff showing up all the time. So let's actually change this, give it a different name. This is my baseline. These are the processes that should be running on this computer. So now if I launch a few extra things, let me show you a neat trick. Compare object is going to take 2 sets of data. The first set I'm going to bring in from that snapshot, that baseline. And I'm going to compare that to the current list of processes on the computer. Now, processes have got stuff that's always going to be different. right? From moment to moment, things like CPU and memory and stuff like that are always changing. There's a couple of things about a process that never change during its life, and one of those is the name. You could also put the ID, but the ID doesn't mean anything to me as a human. The name is something I can recognize. So I'm just going to have it compare the name between these two sets. Now, pay real close attention here. We're using a parenthetical. So this is going to run first because parentheses mean do this first. And whatever that command produces will be fed there. That parameter is our baseline, our reference. Then this is going to run. And whatever it produces is going to go there. And that's our potential difference set. Then compare object will run using all three, 1, 2, 3, of my parameters, and it's going to compare those two sets and see if any of them have different property names. Whoops, did not mean to do that. I do not want to toggle my display. So let's run it. And you can see that on the side, the difference side, Calc, MS Paint, and Notepad are different. This service host pops up because I think MS Paint actually starts a service of some kind. And so that's probably different there as well. So you get those four differences. All right, now let's go ahead and close these. Don't need all that garbage running. Let's run it again. So now we've got that one service host instance that's different between the two. So that's a neat trick. I've actually got folks who have batch files, scripts, with a couple hundred compare object lines, and each line is comparing something different in the operating system configuration. And they use this as a change management report. Now, they don't look at it on the screen. No, no, no. They take those results and pipe them to convert to HTML. Because they're thinking, hey, I'd like to put this on an intranet web server so folks can look at it. And, well, hey, you asked for HTML, you get it. Remember, the convert to verb means change the form and put it into the pipeline. Now here, because there was nothing left in the pipeline, it was picked up by out default and displayed on the screen. So if I wanted it to go somewhere else, I have to pick that HTML up out of the pipeline, differences. Now I could potentially open that up in Internet Explorer. Let's see here, differences HTML. And it looks like we had no differences that time, so we got a blank file. Blank is good news. And convert to HTML has got a bunch of different property parameters you can. In fact, we should do this. I hope you're in the habit of this by now, but in case you're not, anytime you learn about a new command, it's a good idea to look at the help, because then you're going to get an idea of other things it can do. Look, import CSV has a delimiter. That same thing, in fact, shows up in export CSV. Oops. Delimiter. So if you want a CSV file that isn't really a CSV, in other words, it's not comma separated, you can specify a different delimiter to separate things by. So that's pretty interesting. Get into the help for convert to HTML. It's got a lot of stuff. You can put a title, you can put some text in the body, you can hook it up to a cascading style sheet if you want to style it. In fact, if you want to just see what one of those looks like, since we're playing with conversions, get service, convert to HTML, out file, that's what it looks like by default. It's a flat file, so it's a lot like a CSV. You know, it's not displaying a hierarchy. It's doing this stuff when it gets a bunch of things it has to do. But you could attach a style sheet to this and style it up, make it nice and pretty. In fact, on PowerShell.org, there's a free ebook called Creating HTML Reports in PowerShell that kind of walks you through making a really beautiful report with dynamic stuff. And we're going to walk through that entire process in one of the last nuggets in this series. So you're going to really get to play with those HTML reports. I think they're crazy useful. Great way to produce something attractive for management purposes. Now, the last thing I want to make sure you're really, really on board with is this. Let's just get anything. Log name, security, newest 10, export, CSV. What's that going to do? I really want you, in fact, hit the pause button. I want you to think about exactly what is going to happen. What is going to be written to disk when I'm done with this? Let's see. Hopefully, that's close to what you expected. I asked this to do recentlogs.csv, and there it is. And from the byte size, I'm guessing there's something interesting in there. I asked this to do something.csv. There it is. Looks like it probably contains a carriage return and a line feed and nothing else. Why? Well, draw your pipeline. We've got 3 chunks this time, right? Because we've got 3 commands running. This is putting stuff into the pipeline. It's going to here. That's creating the file on disk, right there, but it's not putting anything into the pipeline. So when this ran, and it went to pick up its stuff out of the pipeline, there was nothing to pick up out of the pipeline. Furthermore, this didn't put anything into the pipeline either. So when our secret out default ran, it's like, okay, I got nothing to do. And that's what we got on the screen. Nothing. So it's really important to think about what's in the pipeline at each stage, and you will prevent yourself from making some of these these little snafus that newcomers run into a lot of the times with PowerShell. This command doesn't produce what PowerShell considers to be output. Yeah, it writes something to disk, but PowerShell doesn't think of that as output. There's nothing going in the pipeline. So no matter what you put here, it's not going to have anything to do because there's nothing in the pipeline for it to do it with. So just always be thinking, every single time you run a command, put your finger on the screen. I don't care about fingerprints. Put your finger on the screen on each pipe character and think to yourself, what's in the pipeline right here? And if you don't know, if you're putting your finger on this pipe right here and you're going, I've got no idea what's in the pipeline at that point, back it off a step. Delete that and run your command. Oh, there's nothing in the pipeline at that point. That's what's in the pipeline at that point. Nothing. If you're putting your finger here and you're like, I've got no idea what's in the pipeline at that point, back it off a step. Run the command again. That's what's in the pipeline at that point. So always be thinking about what's in the pipeline at each stage, and you'll make many, many, many fewer mistakes as you work with this thing. We've taken the first step to getting you working with the PowerShell pipeline, and by way of example, you saw a lot about how to import, export, and convert things in the pipeline, and you looked at some formats like CSV, CLI XML, and HTML. And while all of those are definitely useful things to work with, the real lesson here is to think about what is in the pipeline. Always be able to put your finger on that pipe character and know, or at least have a good idea what you think is in the pipeline at that point, because that's what really controls how all these commands connect together. We're going to be getting more complicated commands coming up, and it's always important to know what's in the pipeline at each step. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you